Bienvenue à la deuxième journée du colloque du CIÉRA, le 16e. Excusez un peu de retard, mais le taxi a eu du mal à trouver le musée de la civilisation, malheureusement. Peut-être quelque chose sur la culture des taxis. En tout cas, donc, le juge Musée est là pour sa présentation. Pour ceux qui ne le connaissent pas, c'est quand même un homme qui a un parcours impressionnant. Premier juge autochtone cours du Manitoba. Et qui est allé jusqu'au banc de la Reine au Manitoba, donc la plus haute cour du Manitoba, qui aussi a présidé de nombreuses commissions, mais la commission la plus importante, c'est la commission vérité et réconciliation. Et le sujet de notre colloque aujourd'hui, c'est véritablement cette question-là. Donc il nous présentera un peu sur les recommandations et sur l'exercice de la commission Vérité et Réconciliation. Oui, il faut que je précise aussi, Monsieur Musée est un Anishinaabe du Manitoba. Anishinaabe, is it? Yeah. So, c'est ça. Et maintenant, sénateur indépendant au Sénat. Et donc, je le remercie d'être venu d'Ottawa et d'avoir fait le déplacement pour s'adresser à nous. Il va s'adresser en anglais. Yeah. Mais en même temps, on aura son PowerPoint en français. Et I can translate you whenever, if you wish to. If you go out of your PowerPoint, I will translate you. Or you let me know, as you wish in terms of translation. Or I can stop you at one point and start to... You're the boss. Donc, please welcome Senator Musée. So you just have to press that and you move your slide. Okay? Not this one. Yeah, this one will be French, this one will be English. Okay? Hopefully.
Bonjour tout le monde. Je m'excuse, mais je dois parler en anglais parce que bien que je pouvais parler français quand j'étais jeune, parce que ma grand-mère vient de Québec, mais quand nous avons commencé l'école, l'on dirait à Manitoba que l'on ne peut pas parler français ou Ojibwe, mais seulement anglais dans la maison. C'était sa décision. So she was raised in a residential school in Manitoba, and my grandmother, who raised me, required that only English could be spoken after I started school. So as a result, while I can understand everything that's said, I stumble when I speak in French. And when I speak Ojibwe, my family tells me I sound like a lawyer, which means they can't understand anything I say. So I begin with that apology, and I also acknowledge the territory that we're on and thank all of the people who have welcomed me here, including a very interesting taxi driver who was late. He was supposed to pick me up half an hour before he picked me up. And then when he did, he insisted on having a full conversation with me while I was in the back seat. He was constantly staring at me and looking at me, wanting to know all about me. And once in a while, he would look forward. And then he would yell at all of the other people in the street. He was an interesting guy. Yeah. So as a result, I was never sure if he was yelling at me once in a while, because he would be very aggressive with other drivers. But that's the way taxi drivers are in Quebec, I've learned over the years, right? They're all very aggressive, very pushy with their little cars. They have the small cars now. They still drive like they're driving the big trucks. So I begin with acknowledging all of the survivors of the residential schools in Canada, my friends, many of them my relatives. for what they had to endure in order for me to be able to speak for them. We spent a lot of time listening to their stories, and so I wanted to acknowledge them, and I want to acknowledge them each time. And if there are any survivors in the room, I say hello to you. And please introduce yourself to me later after I'm finished. I want to talk to you a bit about the history of residential schools in Canada and the impact that it's had. I have a video at the end, and they told me that I have 8 hours to speak to you. Is that true? Oh, no boundaries. But I'm going to play a small video at the end because it's important for us to understand what the consequences of all of what I'm about to tell you are and why things are the way they are today.
Can I just stop you there?
Yeah.
Est-ce qu'il y a des gens qui ont besoin de la traduction? Ou est-ce que ça va pour tout le monde? N'hésitez pas, sinon, just ask me if somebody,
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're all okay so far? I'll try not to speak Ojibwe, then you'll never understand me. So, just after Confederation in 1867, the government of Canada decided to change its approach with Indigenous people in Canada. The First Nations people, the Métis, and the Inuit people in northern Canada. Up until that point, until Confederation, there had been a relationship of cooperation between, although there was certainly racism on the one side, on the government side, on the European side. There was a belief that these were still inferior people, but from a government perspective to government perspective, there was a relationship that had to be respected, so it wasn't like they could dominate the other peoples or take over their territory in particular. In 1763, after the French-English War and the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1759, there was a great concern on the part of the English Crown that Indigenous people would take advantage of the European forces, the English forces primarily, that remained in North America, because after the war, their military resources were pretty depleted. And so the English Crown was concerned that the Indigenous people would rise up against them. So a royal proclamation was issued in 1763 by the King of England to all Indigenous people and to all people in North America, promising that the lands upon which Indigenous people were staying and their internal governance would not be affected by the Crown, would be respected from that point forward. And that Royal Proclamation of 1763 is part of our Constitution in Canada. That Royal Proclamation promised Indigenous people that the Crown would not take their land away from them, would not assert any jurisdiction over their internal functioning, and would not interfere with their ability to deal with their own affairs. And for that reason, the relationship with the Crown was at a government-to-government level, but also was a respect level. And that relationship promise that was made by the Crown was communicated to Indigenous leaders throughout North America who were called to a gathering in 1764 at Fort Niagara. And those promises were repeated in their languages to all of the Indigenous leaders. About 3,800 of them gathered in order to hear the King's words. And Sir William Johnson, who was the King's representative in North America at that time, communicated that to all of the Indigenous leaders, all of the people who came to that gathering. And from people from as far away as British Columbia and as far north as northern Quebec and south to the southern United States, all gathered to hear these words. And that gathering at Fort Niagara is often referred to as the Treaty of Niagara, 1764. So that promise by the Crown was known to Indigenous people. And after Confederation, it was believed by Indigenous people that that promise would continue. But it was also made known to Indigenous people in the West that the Dominion of Canada, which was only in the East, wanted to expand. And so that desire for expansion was undertaken relatively quickly, initially by the Crown without consent. And you may know a bit of the history of Manitoba, that when the government representatives attempted to assert jurisdiction, they were stopped by the Métis leader, Louis Riel, who said, "You cannot come and take our land just like that. You have to deal with us." And so the surveyors were stopped, the government representatives were stopped. Legislation was sought to create the province of Manitoba, the Northwest Territories, and a treaty was negotiated with the First Nations people, Treaty Number 1, to have them surrender their land. All of this is important because in the treaty, in all of the treaties that were negotiated, there is a promise in the treaty that was asked for by the Indigenous leaders for schools to educate their children, because they wanted their children to be able to be as educated as the little white children, as the negotiators referred to it. They wanted their children to be as educated as the little white children so that they could compete in this new relationship, this society that was being created. And so the schools clauses were negotiated so that there would be an effort on the part of the government, a promise made and an effort made to establish schools on the reserves with teachers that were approved by the First Nations leaders to educate the children. The government of Canada, under Sir John A. Macdonald, though, had its own hidden agenda, and that hidden agenda was permeated with very racist beliefs that Indigenous people were never going to be very well educated. Sir Egerton Ryerson in 1858, for the colony of Upper Canada, what is now Ontario, had done a study for the colony about education of the children in the colony. And in his report, he said, "We should establish a public education system for all of the children in the colony, except for Indigenous children, who are incapable intellectually of being as well educated as the little white children, as our children. So therefore, they should only be trained to be the workers who will help our children succeed in their positions." So the intention behind Ryerson's report was Indigenous children would be educated to become working class people, and the non-Indigenous children would be educated to become the intellectual elite of the colony. And that thinking was behind Egerton Ryerson's establishment of public schools. But it was also Macdonald's thinking, because Macdonald was essentially a racist. He didn't like people who were not white European people. He had a lot of policies that were very despising of people of color, Asian people, people from Africa. They were not allowed to come into Canada under his leadership. And if they were, it was only to provide physical labor for the rail line, for the needs of the communities. So during his era, for example, there were limitations placed upon Chinese people who came, Japanese people who came from Asia, people from South Asia who came, all had limitations placed upon their entry, because he believed that Canada should be what he referred to as a white Aryan nation. That's Sir John A. Macdonald's belief. And part of his belief was that these Indigenous people needed to be assimilated. They needed to be changed so that they could be not be seen as being part of the country in a different way, or with different cultural beliefs or different traditions. So when he moved forward, he moved forward from the perspective that while education for Indigenous people was to educate their children equally, from the government perspectives, he wanted them to be treated as though, and because he believed they were uncivilized and that they were socially, culturally, and intellectually inferior, and he wanted them removed from their families so that they could be indoctrinated into this new culture. If I get ahead of you, or if you feel you want to speak?
Are you moving the slide because I can't see?
Oh, yes, I am.
Oh, yeah, okay, good.
Oh, okay, that's right, you need to.
Yeah, no, I need to coordinate.
You want me to move it at the same time?
Yeah, no, I just need to check where you are. Good.
You can stand right beside me if you want.
No, I don't want to.
Okay.
Good.
All right, next slide. So this is a quote that Sir John A. Macdonald gave in the House of Commons in 1883. As you can see, he says, if the children are educated in their communities, they're just going to end up to be educated savages. They will be savages who can learn to read and write, because that's how he saw Indigenous people, as savages. And that idea about how Indigenous people were to be thought of was permeated the education system that he was prepared to fund. So he, instead of building schools on the reserves, you can go to the next slide if you want. Instead of building schools on the reserve, he established schools on land that was far from the reserves, that were referred to as industrial schools initially, because that's what Ryerson called them. Ryerson used the industrial school model that was used for rehabilitation and training of delinquent children who needed to be reformed. So they were what we would now call, what we would call and called for many years, reform schools. Children were sent there in order to be changed, to have their behavior altered. So this is just an example of some of the schools that were built early on, and altogether they built several hundred of these schools in order to educate the children. Some of them were run by the government, some of them were run by other entities, but primarily by religious organizations. Next. So when the residential school system came under scrutiny by the courts, eventually a settlement agreement was reached, and that's how the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created. When we began our study and started to do our research, we found that in the settlement agreement there's 130 some schools that are listed, but altogether Indigenous children were sent to over 1,400 different schools in Canada, many of them public schools, some of them public schools that were run by religious societies, some of them run by provinces or by territorial governments. But in the schools that were listed in the settlement agreement, the only ones for which the government took responsibility, legal responsibility, 150,000 children were taken and placed there, some of them as young as 4 years of age. How many of you have a 4-year-old in your life today? How many of you have a grandchild or a child who's 4 years old, a nephew? I do. I have a grandson who's going to be 4 pretty soon. And every time I look at him, I think it was at that age that some of those children were taken away and placed into these schools. And children are never too young to learn. In fact, he goes to a Montessori program every day in order to learn how to play and learn how to count and how to be socialized with other children. But he comes home every night, and his mother sometimes spends the day there with him. So it's a real positive social experience. But these children were taken away from their mothers. They were taken away from their families. They were taken away from their communities. And some of them never saw them again. They never saw them again. My grandmother was taken from her family when she was 5 years old and placed in a residential school. And she was not allowed to go home ever again. her mother used to come and try to visit her in the school. And it was a trip of about 100 miles for her mother to come and find her, to see her. But the school would not let her mother in to visit with her. So sometimes, my grandmother used to tell me, sometimes her mother would camp outside the school for the whole summer, waiting for a chance to see her little girl. And can you imagine what that was like? And when her mother died, she was still in the school. She was not allowed to go to her mother's funeral because they didn't want that family bond to be recreated or re-strengthened. And my grandmother was not allowed to leave the school until she married my grandfather. So she had to agree to be married to another Christianized, educated, indigenous man before she could leave, because they didn't want her to go home and marry a pagan, a savage, and have little savages. They wanted her to raise Christian children. And in fact, my grandfather had to promise, as part of his marriage obligation, that all of their children be raised in the church and that they would dedicate one of their children to the church. They couldn't find anybody in my father's era who would be dedicated to the church, and when I came along, they convinced me that I was going to become a priest. So you see how badly those decisions can turn out for them. I did not become a priest, and in fact, to a certain extent, sometimes I am the church's worst nightmare. In the schools, though, the schools were very harsh places. They were hard on the children because not only were they isolated, but children were not allowed to talk to their brothers and sisters. They were not allowed to see their families, of course, unless sometimes the schools would let their families come and visit with them. Sometimes the children would go home. So not all of the schools were the same. Children would sometimes be allowed to go home, particularly if they were close and the families could arrange to come and get them. But the schools would not pay for them to go home. And there's much correspondence, in fact, from some of the school administrators that went to the families saying, "We'll let your child come home and visit you and stay with you for the summer if you promise that you will not speak to him in your language, and you must also promise not to take him to any ceremonies, any Indian ceremonies." So they had to basically not undermine the school's education. The schools themselves were poorly built. The food in the schools was not very good. Children were malnourished. And we've heard, of course, about some of the schools being used by governments and other program leaders for food experiments and for medical experiments. Human rights violations occurred in one of the schools you probably have heard of, in St. Anne's Residential School in Fort Albany. Children were subjected to punishment by being seated in an electric chair, or chair that was wired to electrical prods. And they were tortured through electric currents that were passed through their bodies as punishment. Not all schools did that. It's the only school we know of who did that, but it certainly exemplifies the attitude towards punishing the children. Many of the children ran away. Some of them lost forever. We heard many stories of children's bodies who were found north of Fort Alexander in Manitoba, for example. There's a story in one of the communities of some of their trappers finding bodies of 3 little boys on the ice in the lake who had tried to get to their home community further north, but they had obviously lost their way and perished in the wintertime. And as their bodies were, the discovery of the bodies was communicated to the school, but the school wouldn't come and collect the bodies, and the bodies were buried in the local trappers' community. So the bodies were never even returned to their families. They were just left there for the community to deal with. Children were punished harshly. Little children, of course, and children generally in indigenous communities were not physically punished as other families might have, but they weren't dealt with in the same way. There was no belief that, there was a very strong belief in many indigenous communities that you don't hit your child. And yet in the schools, they were constantly being punished. We'll see, in fact, in the video, I'm going to play for you about some of the things that the children had to endure. They were not allowed to speak their language in the school, in the playground, in the dormitories, anywhere on the grounds, and if they were physically punished for that. And this went on from generation to generation. Schools were in place for 140 years approximately, and that's about 7 generations of children that went through the schools. If they'd only been in place for 1 or 2 generations, probably the communities and the families could have endured that, could have dealt with that through their own traditional ceremonies, but each succeeding generation returned home and had children and lost the ability to speak the language and the ability to understand and know their own culture. Because the same message that was going on in the residential schools was also going on in the public schools. Not every child went to a residential school. Only about 35% went to a residential school. The rest went to public schools over the years. But in the public schools, the children were taught the same thing, that they were savages, they were heathens, they were inferior, they were pagans, and that they had to civilize, they had to Christianize in order to be part of Canadian society. And they had no rights. They were treated as irrelevant to Canadian history. And that does something to your sense of self. Very much harmed the children. Disease in the school was rampant. Death rates in the schools were very high. In our report, we pointed out that children were dying so often in the schools and at such high death rates that you had a better chance of dying in a residential school than you did if you went to war in the Second World War. The death rates were higher among residential school students than they were among soldiers in the Second World War. There is a report that was done by Dr. Peter Bryce in the early part of the 20th century when he did a study of death rates in the schools, and he reported that in some schools the death rates were as high as 60% of the children. And he had a letter drafted from a lawyer, friend of his, to pass on to the government as part of his report, warning the government that if the death rates continued at that rate, that some people in government faced a very good chance of being prosecuted for criminal negligence or manslaughter, for putting children into conditions where they would die so hard or at such high rates. And in the United Nations Convention on Genocide, one of the elements of genocide, in fact, is to create conditions of life that are so harsh that children or people will die at unusually high rates. So they were potentially running the risk of contravening what was later put in place in the 1940s, Convention on Genocide. Next slide. So this is Peter Bryce's report. And when he issued his report to the government received the report, acknowledged it, and then they fired him. And he was the director of health services for Indian residential schools. He was a medical doctor, a well-trained man. And his report was suppressed. It was never released publicly until after he had been fired and he tried to get his job back and he followed all the legal protocols to try to get his position renewed, but it was not. And then he wrote a book. And the book that he wrote, in it he talked about his findings. So Dr. Peter Bryce's contribution to residential schools was not going to come to fruition until our work started to be undertaken because we discovered his report. Others discovered it too. Historians pointed out some of his findings. And when he wrote his book and he issued it, he called his book a national crime. A national crime. Because he said, this is a crime against humanity. This is a crime against these little children and these people, what we are doing to them. So when we start talking about the question of reconciliation, the question becomes, what do we really need to do in order to move forward and establish reconciliation? We get into long discussions about what reconciliation means. Reconciliation is not about forgiveness. It's not about trying to establish a peaceful relationship. Reconciliation is essentially just about coming to terms with this past so that the people of this society can figure out how to move forward together. Both those who come from the historical group that was involved in the establishment of these schools, those who were victims of this experience, because there are still many survivors today, those who are the children of those victims, those who are from the group that were affected by this directly, but also for newcomers who come to this country who are not part of this story. And we have large populations of people who come here in the last 25 to 50 years who had nothing to do with the operation of residential schools, and in fact came from countries where their people were victimized in similar ways. And they would not have approved of this. But we all have a responsibility to reconciliation. But it begins, first of all, by knowing this story. You have to know the truth of the history of this country and what went on. And there are still many people who deny the validity of our findings in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and many people who deny the stories of the survivors. They say that the survivors were not telling the truth. Well, quite frankly, you don't have to rely on our report, and you don't have to rely upon the survivors' report. You just have to look at the records of the death rates. Children were dying in huge numbers. Children were running away from the schools. The reports of the abuses that the children experienced are contained in the church's own records. And so we don't have any difficulty saying that this is a truthful story. This is what this experience was all about. And we need to accept that so that we can move on together. And until we learn to accept it, the relationship between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people will always be a troubled one. So the other thing to understand is that there is an expression in English that is, it takes a village to raise a child. In the communities you come from, I think you all know that, you depend upon your community to be a good, solid, stable, moral community, because that will have an impact upon your child. You want your children to believe that the people who live around them are good-thinking people. And they learn from that. So they learn from their churches, they learn from their teachers, they learn from the leaders of their community how to behave. They learn from their role models and their heroes about what it means to do the right thing. So good, solid living experiences come from the teachings of our community. We send our children to schools now. We send our children to churches in order for them to learn the teachings of the things that we want them to know, because we believe in those things. So it takes a village to raise a child. The government knew that. And so not only did they take the children and try to change them, they decided to destroy the villages too, in as many ways as they could. So they passed laws which made it illegal to participate in Indigenous ceremonies. They passed laws that made it illegal for adults to prevent their children from going to the schools. They passed laws that made it illegal for Indigenous people to attend large gatherings. They made it an offense for an Indigenous people to go to court without permission from the government. If you wanted to make a claim against the government, you had to get permission from the Minister of Indian Affairs before you could hire a lawyer, or you could talk to a lawyer. The lawyer would be disbarred if he spoke to you without getting permission. If you wanted to sue the government, you had to get permission before you could go to court. Government never gave permission to being sued. And on top of all of that, if you gathered together in order to discuss your grievances against the government, you were guilty of an offense. In 1883, they passed laws called the Indian Conspiracy Laws, which made it an offense for 3 or more Indian people to gather together to complain about the government. And those conspiracy laws were used to prevent people from gathering. So if it was known that people were gathered together, that they would be prevented from doing so. Violence within the schools, of course, was also became reflected in violence in the communities. And we now see it in the high rates of incarceration and in the high rates of children being taken into care. When we look at all of this, and we documented it, we issued a 6,000-page report. And it does have pictures in it, so don't be too intimidated by that number. And we did issue a summary of it, but the summary is 400 pages. And so we issued a summary of the summary, just to make it easy for people to understand what it is that we need to do about all of this. We developed 94 calls to action. Now, we used the term calls to action deliberately because we didn't want people to think of these as simply recommendations. Recommendations are things you tell people, well, you don't have to do it. Do it if you want, but it's a recommendation, nothing else. A recommendation would not be treated very seriously. A call to action, on the other hand, moves the issue to a higher level, and that's what we wanted people to see, that this had to go to a higher level. So in our calls to action, I'm on the next one. In our calls to action, we have some very deliberate efforts to address the immediate problems, and the immediate problems are in the area of child welfare, education, language and culture, health and justice. So we point out that in those areas, Indigenous people are way behind the rest of society and need to be brought to a common point. So there's an immediate need here that, in our first 42 calls to action, are about addressing the immediate picture and moving the situation to a more significantly equal place. In our later calls to action, the latter half of the calls to action, 43 to 94, we talk about the long term and the importance of the long term, what government needs to do in the government-to-government relationship. We talk about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or as it's come to be called, UNDRIP. We talk about the importance of having a royal proclamation issued on reconciliation and a covenant on reconciliation, which we refer to as a national treaty to be signed by Indigenous leaders so that we can begin a dialogue and continue a dialogue on reconciliation. We also talk about the need for a national council on reconciliation whose purpose would be to monitor government, society, and religious efforts to move the relationship forward, and Aboriginal communities as well, so that everybody's moving in the same general direction. So in the short term, we advise people, because one of the most common questions we get is, what can I do? And my quick answer to it is, in the short term, read the report, look at the calls to action, learn what you can, lead where you can, lend a hand where you can. There are people who are trying to do things. Particularly, we found many people in church congregations and community groups are doing what they can to inform themselves. There's an elderly woman, Clara Hughes. Do you know Clara Hughes? The athlete? She's the Olympic athlete in cycling and in ice skating. Clara Hughes' mom, Clara Hughes was one of our honorary witnesses. Clara Hughes' mom took a real interest in our work, and Clara Hughes' mom decided that as part of her act of reconciliation, she was going to teach all of her friends about the TRC report. So she started holding what she called her granny gatherings. So she would call all of her friends and say, come to my house for tea and cookies and cake, and they would all gather together, and she would read one call to action to them, and they'd talk about it. And then after they had talked about it, they would maybe call somebody to come and explain it to them, or they might have a dialogue with some of their children or their grandchildren, so they would bring other people into the conversation. So that was her commitment, and that's been a very important commitment to do that. And that's it's something as simple as that is really what we need to get people to think about. But I'll tell you a side story to that. At one of their gatherings, they were watching a video of one of the speeches I made, and one of the grandmothers had brought her granddaughter to that event, and her granddaughter was going to give birth to a baby soon. She was in her 8th month of pregnancy. And her granddaughter, after it was all over, they were talking about the video, and her granddaughter said, "Oh, I love Justice Sinclair. I think he is just the most wonderful man I've ever heard speak. I'm going to name my baby after him." And so when she had her baby, she named her baby after me. And so somewhere in Winnipeg, there's a little boy named Justice. It's a true story. She named him Justice. I think she thought that was my name, but nonetheless, it's when you have that kind of gathering and people are actually beginning to talk, you have an impact on their lives, and that impact will extend, in that case, for at least one more generation. In the long term, I think institutionally we have to make changes. We have to recognize that the way we're doing business has to change in every field. If you look at our calls to action, you can see how we recommend the medical field needs to do some change. The legal field, professionals need to be doing some things differently. Business world has to be doing things differently. Churches have to change the way they talk about Indigenous people and show more respect for Indigenous spirituality. So there's lots of things in the long term that we have hopes to affect change in. But getting to reconciliation is not going to be easy. It's actually going to be much harder to do that than it was getting to the truth of this. It took us 7 years to get to the truth. It's probably going to take us 7 generations to get to a process where the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people is back on a more positive note. I say 7 generations. It could be quicker than that. Depends on how much we are committed to it. And we have to be sure that we commit to it early and we commit to it constantly, so that every day we are working to reconciliation. So now the question is, what does all of this have to do with us? How does it affect us? And what does it mean for us to be in this situation? And why is this so important? So I want to show you a video that will bring home to you, I hope, why this is important. A little comment about the video. Aaron Peters was a young man in his early 20s. He came to see me in 1996 after I had completed the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry report in Manitoba. And he said he had a song he wanted to play for me, and he played me that song. That was him singing on the video. And so he sang that song, and I said, you know, you have to record that, and you have to distribute it. So he did, initially as just as a record. And then he got into producing music. And then when we started the TRC, I called him up and I said, Aaron, you know that song that you have? I'd like us to help you get it placed into video format so we can play it at some of the events. It's a very powerful video, and it tells the story of residential schools and the impact it had upon the lives of the young people there. And also it connects it to the children in care in the foster system. And so with his assistance, and in fact his direction, because he directed the video, he put it together for us in that way. So Truth and Reconciliation Commission paid for the production partially for the production of that. He also had others. And so I always tell people, if you want to let people know what the impact of residential schools is, play this video. And it's on YouTube. Just look up Aaron Peters and Perfect Crime, and you'll have access to it. I also just want to finish on this note, and that is that we can stop this video. It's going to play another one. Thank you. Just want to end on this note that I went to law school because my grandmother, she wanted me to get an education, and I said initially I wanted to be a teacher, but that ended up after my experience in the first couple of years of school that I found I wasn't a very good teacher. So I moved to law because I wanted to get into politics. But I found that when I was practicing law, that I was a bit confused by the fact that I was becoming, or I had become part of a system that had for so long oppressed Indigenous people, and I was concerned about that. I initially decided to give up practicing law and go do something else, but I was persuaded by elders to actually concentrate more upon learning about myself and my history and my story and my family story and the story of our community, and learn to use that as part of my work as a lawyer. And so that's what I've done. That's part of my process of reconciliation for my grandmother, for all of the survivors, all of those who are affected by this, but mainly for you, because I want you to know this. If you know this, and if you now can figure out how you can help to help this country overcome this, then I will have done my work. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Senator. You became a very good teacher now. I guess you just needed a bit of time to develop that, but thanks a lot. That was very generous, and I think some people would like to ask a few questions. Will you be open to that? So
Your hands, if you have time.
we'll find time. Time is. So we'll take a few questions. So si vous voulez les faites en français, je pourrais les traduire au sénateur Murray, mais sinon, vous pouvez les faire en anglais aussi.
Hi, thank you, Senator. Thank you, Justice Honesty, for your presentation. In fact, I want to introduce myself. I'm an academic, but I'm also an activist. I work for Amnesty International, and I want to take some time to personally congratulate you for your Ambassador of Conscience Prize of last year for Amnesty International, first of all. Also, I want to have your word on one idea. I just came back from New York from the Permanent Forum, and I start to hear a lot of ideas to push forward the idea of genocide for residential schools. And why not ethnic cleansing? What do you think about that? Do we need to push forward this idea inside the international forum, for example, to be recognized that as genocide formally?
Does this work?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. It's one that many survivors themselves are struggling with, whether or not that's important to their healing or not. And ultimately, that's really the issue for me. What is it that
needs to be done in order to help survivors to be able to come to terms with this past for themselves and move forward in healing. And for some survivors, they want nothing less than vengeance and somebody to be held accountable. One of the main difficulties is that almost all the perpetrators of abuse within the schools are dead, no longer alive. There's very few abusers who are alive, other than the students themselves who became abusers while in the schools. And so what we are left with, and I've made this point to survivor groups, and I'll repeat it here, I said if we insist upon people being prosecuted for the actual abuse that took place in the schools, either through the use of criminal law or through the use of international forums like the International Criminal Court, then what we are going to do is we are going to create and perpetuate more division among ourselves, and we will prevent ourselves from being able to really come to terms with this. Because the one thing I can tell you from experience, and I was a judge for 28 years, is that criminal courts are not about healing. Criminal courts are about punishment and are about dealing with how to prevent people from committing this kind of offense again. And if you can accomplish that through a more reformative justice approach, then courts are starting to move in that direction. But from the perspective of some, they're not interested in that. They're interested in vengeance. And so my response always is prosecuting individuals for acts of ethnic cleansing or acts of vengeance will now target Indigenous people because they're the only perpetrators that are left. A lot of abuse that took place in the last 20 years of residential schools was student-on-student abuse. And so those are the ones that are more difficult because many of those students continue to live in the same communities with each other. And many of those perpetrators who are still alive are themselves going to have to bear the burden of those prosecutions. We could technically, I guess, take Canada to court in the international forum, in the International Criminal Court for genocide, but keep in mind that most legal opinions, and we sought a number of legal opinions over the years of the TRC, most legal opinions will suggest to you that after the passage of the UN Convention on Genocide, Canada started to make efforts to close down the schools. The UN Convention was passed in 1949, and in 1950, Canada declared its official policy that the schools were going to be closed. They remained open for another 20 years, primarily because the Catholic Church, which ran about 74% of the schools, didn't want the schools closed down. They wanted the schools to remain open, and Canada acceded to that request, but they started to turn the schools over to the churches and over to Indigenous communities. So Canada itself probably did all that it could to get out of the school business after the UN Convention, and they may have a defense to being prosecuted. So I have my doubts that a prosecution could be successful. But having said all of that, before the UN Convention was in place in 1949, everything that Canada did was in contravention of the UN Convention terms. If they tried to do that today, they would and could be prosecuted for breaching the UN Convention in many different ways. But the UN Convention wasn't in place, and Canada actually did not officially adopt the UN Convention into domestic law until 1976, I think. So that's another legal hurdle. So the question about whether or not we should move forward to prosecute for genocide or prosecute for ethnic cleansing, I say to you is it's a complicated question. It's not an easy question. It will probably end up targeting Indigenous perpetrators, indigenous, particularly indigenous students in the school who themselves abused other students. It will probably not be successful, and it will clearly, in my view, not achieve the ends of reconciliation. Reconciliation will be achieved if we can figure out a way to come to terms with this without having to hold somebody, without having to use the criminal court process. But having said that, I recognize that there is still a significant group, and I don't mean number-wise, I just think in terms of vocal power. There's a significant group of people who want there to be a prosecution. In our report, we refer to this as cultural genocide. Truth and Reconciliation Commission was legally prohibited from making a finding of legal liability, so we could not say that it was an act of genocide. But we did say it was an act of cultural genocide, and cultural genocide is genocide. Raphael Lemkin pointed out as much. But we pointed out that we don't need to concentrate upon the issue of death so much. We need to concentrate upon the fact that the schools were primarily, constantly about eliminating indigenous people as an identifiable race.
Je vais exprimer ma question en français.
Oui.
En rapport avec la précédente question, je voudrais dire que le grand chef, Willie Littlechild, a pendant plusieurs dizaines d'années été présent à l'ONU et a contribué à l'élaboration de la Déclaration universelle des droits des peuples autochtones, et je l'ai croisé également à Igloolik il y a quelques années, quand il présidait la commission là-bas pendant 3 jours. Et donc, il est un ambassadeur. Il était la semaine dernière à l'ONU et il est intervenu, il intervient. Donc, je crois qu'à l'international, la commission a un représentant à travers sa personne très actif et qui a toujours cherché le positif, comment réparer, comment réconcilier. Alors je voulais demander au sénateur, dont j'ai beaucoup apprécié sa présentation, quel était son rôle dans la commission auprès des autochtones, y compris les Inuits qui n'étaient pas de sa culture, mais il s'était entouré de plusieurs leaders comme Peter Hernerk, qui a été le représentant de la reine au Nunavut. Voilà ma question. Merci.
When we began our community work in 2010, we started doing community hearings. Our first community hearing was in Kuujjuaq, in northern Quebec, and we held hearings for the first 19 hearings we held were in Inuit communities in the north. And it's interesting. It was interesting and important for us to do that because the Inuit people were most eager to talk to us because many of the survivors were still alive. The Inuit people were not forced into the residential school system until the Second World War. They didn't become targeted until the government decided they needed to get them off the land, and they needed to change them, as they did with the indigenous people in the South. There is, in fact, a report. The government issued a report in the 1920s, I think, or early part of the 1900s, basically saying, let's leave the Inuit alone because then they'll just die off eventually and we don't have to worry about them. But when military presence in the north became an issue, and the military challenge, or the challenge of international pressure on northern Canada, became an issue, and when access to northern resources became an issue, the government's response was, and also after the Supreme Court of Canada decision in the Eskimo case, as they called it, which made it a federal jurisdiction to deal with Inuit people, the government decided that it was necessary for them to remove the Inuit from the land, and so they started to take the children. And in some cases, entire communities lost all of their children to residential schools. And they didn't send them to nearby schools. Of course, there were no schools in the north. There, almost all of the children in Baffin Island, for example, in the communities in Baffin Island, were sent to residential schools in Edmonton, Montreal area, and in Yellowknife. So they were sent thousands of kilometers away. And many of them didn't return because they couldn't, once they were released from the schools wouldn't pay their way back home, and they couldn't afford to get back home on their own, and the government wouldn't pay. So many of them just got abandoned at the schools in the south, which is why, southern communities have some of the southern communities have such large Inuit populations. So the impact on the Inuit community of residential schools was very serious, and most serious in recent years, towards the end of the schools.
Yeah, on va prendre une dernière question, because we're running out of time. How long are you staying, Sénateur? When are you leaving?
When you finally show me where my bag is.
We'll make sure you don't find anything.
They've hidden my bag, so I can't leave.
Yeah.
Okay.
So one short question, because we're running out of time a bit.
Thank you, sir. My name is Fabian Alvarez. I came from Colombia. I'm doing the master's degree in Laval University. Right now I know that the Canadian government recognized the genocide, recognized the violence committed with communities, the autochthone communities, the First Nation. I see that in your presentation that you have the Canadian government, have a plan, different programs to fix this situation, these struggles, this violence. So you are talking about the education program, health program, recreation program. I think this kind of program is for any Canadian citizens. So my question is, how about the land? How about the give back the land who was stolen with the government in this community? How about the another program if you want to really fix this problem?
A couple of things that merit a response in that comment. The government does not recognize and does not accept that it committed genocide. While we said so, and I think they're prepared to acknowledge that it was cultural genocide, but they think that that's a non-genocide term. But the government has not admitted that it committed genocide against Indigenous people. And I think it's a bit of a dance response when they say that. It's mainly because they say the UN Convention on Genocide did not come into place until 1949, without acknowledging that everything they did before 1949 at least was consistent with the definition of genocide. So, but that aside, they've not admitted that they're guilty of that. Secondly, the government's responses to the calls to action have not yet been as complete as they need to be. I think they're showing progress. part of the problem that I've enunciated, that I've spoken about with government representatives, has been that they do not have a plan for reconciliation. They don't have a plan. They have a statement from the Prime Minister, several statements from the Prime Minister, and of course the letters that go to each of the cabinet ministers talks about reconciliation, but they don't have a plan. So if they had a plan, then they could use that plan to direct government departments about what to do. And the plan would be a limitation upon what government departments are doing to change them. But they don't have a plan, and that overall plan is needed. And until they develop that overall plan, things will still wander aimlessly. And that's what I see, is that people are wandering aimlessly, wondering about what they can do within government. And to get to your final point about the land, there is certainly a recovery of land initiative that's been started by Indigenous people, and I suspect that it will succeed to a certain extent, but the government itself is not going to secede its land holdings back to Indigenous people easily. I think it could happen as part of a reconciliation initiative in those areas where the government has no intended use for the land or intended purpose for the land, or where they are persuaded that the Indigenous groups have a better need or a better utilization plan for the land. In Winnipeg, for example, there's a former military base right in downtown Winnipeg called Kapyong Barracks, which the government did not need, and they were trying to sell it. And they were stopped by the courts at the request of Indigenous groups to consider giving that land to Indigenous groups for their development. And so now that process is underway. But in terms of the land that has been taken, particularly in the north, the vacant land where people are not yet settled is one issue, but the land under which there are huge, or on which there are huge mineral resources or petroleum resources or lumber resources are still coveted by industry, and the government is when there's a competition between Indigenous people and the land and industry people and the land, the government tends to favor industry. And that exercise is something we're seeing right now with Trans Mountain Pipeline. So I don't think they're there yet. They have to be pushed there, though. And that's part of what I'm trying to do and part of what others are trying to do as well. And I will allow the organizers to move on with the agenda, but I would also indicate that I'm quite willing to step out into the public areas and continue this conversation with any of you that are prepared to find me a cup of coffee.